Hello, everyone. So we have come to the end of week one, covering three chapters, one on the Reconstruction period, the second on westward movement, conquest and expansion, and our final chapter, we talked about the politics, as well as different facets of the Gilded Age. Okay, so we're not going to conclude our discussion with Gilded Age, as I suggested towards the end of my last lecture, but in fact, that will be the foundation upon which our next week's lecture will build on. Okay, so I haven't really prepared a new PowerPoint presentation for this revision lecture recording, but I do want to take this opportunity to kind of go back to our PowerPoint presentations for the last three chapters that we talked about this week, and just highlight some of the major themes and questions that I would like you to be able to grasp by this point into the course. So let us begin with the first chapter on Reconstruction. Okay. So again, this is not entirely new, but just a quick revision. So in this first chapter, we began by talking about Lincoln's approach to Reconstruction. And remember, this began even before the Civil War concluded. So you should be able to describe Lincoln's plan to restore the Union at the end of the Civil War. We also talked very quickly about how radical Republicans responded to Lincoln's plan. So you should also be able to discuss the central tenets of radical republicanism. We then talked about how Congress responded to the situation, what the Northern Republican government did to bring to life its vision of Reconstruction. So you should also be able to talk about the effort made by Congress in 1865 and 1866 to realize its vision of Reconstruction. Okay, so of course the Freedmen's Bureau was a very important part of it. At the same time, Johnson had its own vision. So there was a growing tension between the presidential view of Reconstruction and the effort of Reconstruction initiated by the radical Republicans. So that's kind of what led us to a discussion about radical Reconstruction. So that's kind of the second phase of Reconstruction. And so for this part of the chapter, you should be able to explain the purpose of the second phase of Reconstruction. What are some of the key legislations put forward by Congress? What did radical Reconstruction mean ultimately? As we saw, the tension between President Johnson and Congress got escalated over time. And that led to the impeachment of President Johnson. So you should also be able to talk about the impeachment of President Johnson. Over this course of the radical Reconstruction period, we saw the passing of 14th and 15th Amendments. So you should also be able to talk about both the benefits and drawbacks of the 14th and 15th Amendment. Okay, and toward the end of the second phase of radical Reconstruction period, we saw that women suffragists came forward and voiced their disappointment with the passing of the 15th Amendment. So why is that the case? And in some ways, I want to just take a moment here and step aside and argue that in fact, throughout the second half of the 19th century, right, the concept of gender and the concept of race, they provide, and of course, the concept of class, that was very important. It's going to become more important over the course of the Gilded Age. But these three lenses offered very important ways to understand how American history unfolded over time. So just want to highlight that, step aside, make that clear. So that would allow us to understand why early feminists, including Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony, kind of stepped in at that moment and tried to organize amongst themselves, and in some ways diverted, right, from the civil rights movement. Sorry, from the abolitionist movement. Okay, so what were some of the elements that the next phase of Reconstruction, the last phase, we talked about the collapse. You should be able to talk about the reasons for the collapse. And one of the reasons is the way that the system of sharecropping in many ways maintained the overarching economic and social structure of slavery, even though we don't call it slavery anymore, but then the system continued that. The second part is the ways in which different groups in the South that supported the Northern Republic came together, but in that effort of coming together, they also ignited a significant backlash, right, from the so-called redeemers of the South. So think about how the Ku Klux Klan, the Invisible Empire of the South, kind of capitalized on that and really threatened, for instance, Black voters, but also their white supporters. How the radical Reconstruction phase ultimately ignited a significant backlash, and that also contributed to the collapse. But finally, one of the most important obvious indicator for the collapse was the controversial election of 1876, right? The way that that led to a compromise between Republican and Democratic Congresses, how that signaled that ultimately Reconstruction did not succeed. So you should talk about the reason for the collapse, but also what were some of the efforts of the Southern redeemers try to roll back the gains of Reconstruction. So that brings us to the end of the first chapter. And remember to go back to the key terms for review. Okay, so, okay, I think I just, whoops, let me go back to the PowerPoint again. All right, so here we are. In the second chapter on the Contested West, we start to think about the aftermath of Reconstruction, the aftermath of the Civil War. And just to connect the dots, right? So we saw racial tensions. That was, of course, part of the slavery history, but how that was remade in the Reconstruction period. And in some ways, this is going to be a very important theme too in our discussion about the westward spirit, conquest and expansion, right? There's no way we can think about going west, the effort to go west in the late 19th century in the United States, without thinking about the underlying racial dynamics. Okay, so that's a very important thread that allows us to connect the last chapter with this chapter, and as we'll see with the later chapters as well. Okay, so in the first part of this chapter, we talked about the very fundamental philosophies, right? So this is where the concept of the manifest destiny comes in. So you should be able to explain the evolution of how Americans viewed the West, westward migration. And what were the things that the federal government did to mediate that westward expansion and migration? So some of the key acts, right, including the Homestead Act, for example, and the Pacific Railway Act. We then went on to talk about the mining industry as well as the ranching industry. So why the cattle suddenly become a very important part of the story, but of course also the mining industry as well. So with the second part of this chapter, you should be able to identify some of the major discoveries or developments in the gold and silver mining in the mid-19th century. You should also be able to tell me why the cattle industry became important to the development of the West and how that increasingly became a catalyst for raging wars in the American West. And in this part of the course, We also talked very quickly, so of course, with the expansion, you should also be able to tell me more about what the life of homesteading was like, and what gold rush was like. Okay, but more importantly, this was a period in which there was a growing transparency about how different ethnic groups were being treated, right? So we concluded the second part of this chapter with a discussion about the policies toward Chinese immigrants and Hispanic Americans. So I want to keep that in mind because that, of course, leads very nicely to the third part, the treatment of Native Americans. But in this part, you should be able to describe the treatment of Chinese immigrant and Hispanic citizens during the westward expansion of the 19th century. And in a nutshell, you want to be able to think about how the American government treated these different groups similarly or differently. Some of them had citizenship right, some of them did not. But even with that differences, some of them share, right, similar experiences. For instance, they're all tended to be relegated to low-wage jobs with poor working conditions. So that's a similarity between Chinese immigrants and Hispanics, even though they didn't share the same kind of citizenship status. Of course, they also emerged on the American scene at different points in time and differently, right? So we know that, for example, a lot of Hispanic Americans had already lived in the Southwest, but a lot of the newly arrived Chinese immigrants, they're coming to this country. Sometimes they had established certain Chinatowns, but they were never really there, right, before this period of mass immigration. So that history also should tell you something about the rationale behind some of the policies initiated by the government. Okay. So finally, perhaps one of the most important facets about this era of American history of westward expansion is the government's treatment of Native Americans, right? So how did American Indian life and culture lose its value, right? So you should be able to describe the methods by which the US government used to address what they called Indian threat during the settlement of the West. You should be able to identify some of the key battles that were fought, some of the key acts, right? Putting Indians into reservation system, that's a very important part of it. But eventually, when the violent dimension of Indian treatment came to light, when even Western reformers are denouncing the violent part, the government moved to a more gentler, but no less, in my view, no less violent approach to erase Indian culture and life. That's when they start to put kids into schools and try to change adults' religious and way of life. So, and of course the Dawes Act, which reallowed Indian land. Okay, so in a nutshell, you want to think about how this kind of complicates, right, our discussion so far in terms of a class, gender, but most important in terms of race and ethnicity, right? How does this add to our earlier discussion about how the Reconstruction period reconceived racial relations in American society? This added a new dimension. In some ways, a lot of these controversies behind race, ethnicity, class, and gender are still with us today, right? But they're going to undergo significant transformations in different periods of the 20th century. But we can point to some of those foundations already in the second half of the 19th century. So that's the second chapter. Okay, and finally, we come to the 18th chapter on the Gilded Age. So in the first half of the lectures, we mainly talked about innovations, and the rise of big businesses there. So you want to be able to explain how ideas and products of late 19th century inventions contributed to the rise of big businesses. You want to make those connections on your own. And what are the underlying trends you see here, right? So although we talked about inventions, technology, and economy in the first half of the chapter, and then we move on to talk about politics, as you can see, now we take a step back, they're intimately connected. But how does this rise of industrialization as related to technological innovation, as related to the rise of big entrepreneurship, how those also transformed different dimensions of American life, right? So we talk about, for example, railroads, farming, all those different kinds of economic sectors were significantly transformed over the course of the Gilded Age. So bare minimal, you want to be able to associate certain names with certain innovations. So what was Edison most well known for? What was Bell most well known for? And of course, Westinghouse. And in the context of the big businesses, you want to be able to explain so how the earlier inventions contribute to industrial growth, but also how different business leaders of the era, including Rockefeller, Carnegie, and J.P. Morgan, what were their methods for redefining American business center and finance and banking? So you want to be able to identify the main contributions of Carnegie, Rockefeller, and Morgan, how that shaped the new industrial order, right, in the post-Reconstruction period. You should also be able to identify their primary visions, philosophies, and methods, right? So think about the different kind of business models that Morgan championed and pioneered: vertical, horizontal integration, trusts versus holding company model, all of that. Okay, and of course, with Carnegie, there was a very important discussion about social Darwinism. So what did it mean for social enterprises to borrow this kind of scientific idea from the natural sciences? Okay, why was that so popular? Why was social Darwinism suddenly so popular? Why did it appeal to these big entrepreneurs? What are they trying to accomplish? What kind of inequalities are they trying to perpetuate? Despite the fact that, right, so Carnegie is still trying to spread the gospel of wealth, there's some certain humanistic dimensions behind his belief, but at the same time, it's very ironic in certain ways for trying to hold on to this idea of social Darwinism, right? Only certain groups of people that can expel, and some people cannot. Think about why all these people, all of these business leaders and innovators are white. What did it say about American society at that point in time? There's a lot of hidden messages there that I would like us to be able to unpack and explore. So having said that, and it's also, of course, when we're shifting our attention to politics, there's no, it is no coincidence that some of the political leaders of the era too were holding on to perpetuating certain ideas about class inequality, but that also translate into gender inequality as well as racial inequality as well. So when we get to the second half of the course, when we talk about politics, first off, we want to think about why there was widespread political corruption. And in many ways, this is actually very neatly connected to where we ended with the Reconstruction, right? Because the 1876 election, as we saw, turned out to set the overall tone and tenor of how political life looked like during the Gilded Age. So what was the reason for political corruption? What was the national political scene look like during the Gilded Age? And why so many critics were very adamant in thinking about the Gilded Age as a period of ineffective national leadership? So what were the social problems of Gilded Age? But also why the 1876 election sets the overall tone agenda of the Gilded Age. Okay, and we went on to talk about focusing specifically on the issues of patronage, tariffs, and gold. So you want to be able to explain how each of these were important factors in shaping party loyalty, in shaping party factionalism, but also national politics in particular. What are some of the problems that we now see emerging from the period of the Gilded Age, despite the promise of industrial growth and economic growth. What are some of the new problems? And this will prepare us well as we move into the beginning of the 20th century next week. We move into the way that labor protest and farmer revolt defined a new era of American history. Okay, so I'll stop there since I have highlighted most of the questions, the key themes and questions I'd like you to be able to grasp in each of the chapters. And I just want to end by saying very quickly that we do have a weekly discussion section, and so please do come, and that will be a best opportunity for us to talk about any questions that you might have about the readings or the lectures. All right, thank you.